Again, thank you for asking me to do this. This is a little bit, for an architect, this is like saying, so tell me about your grandchildren. And then to turn around and say, but you have 30 minutes. It's not really a fair fight. But I'll tell you what I can about the project and go through that. Again, my name is Ron Geyer, and I've been architecting for about 30-something years, primarily with churches for the last 20 of those. I came out of the performing arts background, for what that's worth, and some of the earliest projects I was involved with the Peace Center in Greenville, the Newberry Opera House, the Schools of Music at the University of South Carolina and the University of Georgia, performing arts centers, as I say, the Peace Center, the Performing Arts Center at Ole Miss. I've seen a couple of the projects I was fortunate enough to work on broadcast as part of presidential debate sites. And there's another architect in another part of the country, we keep score on who has the most presidential debates. But none of them are as frightening as working on a historic church, because so many people care deeply about how this room looks and feels. Now, many of them feel deeply about it because they have something at stake in the liturgy and the tradition and their own personal history. And I believe that we don't build sacred spaces, but spaces become sacred because of the memories we have of sacred encounters in those spaces. And so if you start tinkering with memory, you start tinkering with that sanctity. But in addition to this room is important to people who care not a bit about this church and its theology and its spiritual life, but simply care about it as an object. So that makes it a particularly volatile sort of thing. Now, Paul gave me, what Paul outlined as what he wanted me to talk about is not at all what he told me. So you know Paul well enough to not be surprised by that. And he gave me this list of things he wanted to talk about, and then he published the title a week later. And the title had nothing to do with the speaking points. And it was Restoring Old Wineskins. My children were convinced that that was my introduction, that was me, I was the old wineskin. And so I had to convince them. But what it did prompt me to take a look at is that verse in Scripture that talks about wineskins. And he used that, but the idea of restoring old wineskins never appears in Scripture. And so I was trying to make that connection and see where we got that. And we use that all the time. And if you're not familiar with it, Matthew 9:17, it also shows up in Mark. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst and the wine is spilled and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved. That's an ESV translation. So it never talks about restoring old wineskins. But in that agrarian culture in which those words were first heard, that naturally would have been the case. Nothing was wasted. And in fact, there's a very strongly detailed process that they would take the wineskins and soak them in water. And you can call that living water. And then once it returned to suppleness, to be sure that it remained useful, it was rubbed with oil. And so there's beautiful imagery and all of that, but old wineskins were never discarded. They were set aside and then restored to use for their proper purpose. And I think that's a beautiful picture of what we're attempting to do here. And too often in the church we use that verse to say, well, that's old, let's get rid of it. Or to say, well, this is why we need to move on. But in fact, Scripture really sets the stage for taking a space that has been of great use for some great length of time and finding a way to make it useful again and useful for in the future. So I think that's a perfect picture from that. Get that, Paul? No problem. Okay. All right, so this room, I'm going to give you just a brief history of the room. Okay, everybody check your phones. I'll check mine. You'll check yours. History of this room. One of the other things that's intimidating about this space is what architects know about it, and you may or may not know about it, is it was designed in 1809. There was an advertisement placed in the Augusta newspaper for a design for a church, and the ad described it as, "We need a neat, substantial, and commodious church," which are words for we needed to be beautiful, we needed to be of sufficient size, and we needed to function properly in modern language. So it's simply a very practical, we need a practical building that's lovely. And one of the proposals they got was from an architect named Robert Mills. And in South Carolina, I'm from Greenville, in South Carolina, we know that name. He was one of the few historic architects that came out of South Carolina. There are a few others that we learn from time to time. We all aspire to be the next one. But Robert Mills is better known to most folks as the architect of the Washington Monument. And he had a grand career all through South Carolina, Georgia, somewhat into North Carolina, and up into Virginia, designing public buildings. But this was one of his first. So he was a young architect. It was an early commission. He probably lowballed the fee, and they got this building for $18,000. So you could buy two now for that. So he got that. That was in 1809. This is 5 years after the church was opened. They built this over about a 3-year period, and there's a really great history of this church that was published at its bicentennial that talks about that. And the original design was a very classical, simple, stripped down design. There's very little ornament. It was a big box church of its era. If you imagine that the other churches around, that when they saw a room being built this big and that simple and without ornament, said, "I can't believe that daggone mega church down the street." They said they have no sense of beauty, they have no sense of history. What are they thinking? So this, in my mind, as I imagine this church, I imagine it as sort of the big box church of 1809, and the kind of thing that we now see as a pre-engineered metal building. It was the simplest kind of structure. It was the simplest kind of ornament. It really was all that the church could afford in that, and so it was perfectly appropriate. Now, one of the interesting things is they had immediately renovated. They added steeple, and they added side galleries that came down both sides. And in the next 200 years, the room was transformed in several big pieces. And I just made a list. The galleries were removed. These windows were two separate windows over and under. You can't see because of the shade, but that's one continuous window. They were joined in the middle of the 19th century into single windows. The crenellated parapets around the outside. And that, at that point, was a theological decision, although it's not documented as such. But if you think about the classical churches, I grew up in a Methodist church. I'm one of the few people in South Carolina who's a Southern Baptist on purpose, and made that decision all by myself. And actually, I told this church that I'm a Reformed Baptist, which means I believe the Bible to be inerrant and applicable to our daily lives, and I didn't do it by myself. So the classical sort of red brick and 4 columns church is based on a Roman model, a pagan model, or a Greek model, which is a pagan model. So if you think about the classical, traditional church, particularly in this part of the world, it is based on the emblem of Rome. And as the church emerged into the Dark Ages, if you will, and engineering changes allowed a new sort of imagery to emerge. Instead of round arches, Gothic arches, which were an engineering innovation before they became a symbolic innovation. All of that was the only style of classical architecture that emerged in the Christian era. So in the middle of the 19th century and on into the second half of the 19th century, a great debate arose over what is the proper architecture for a church. And many churches concluded that the only proper architecture for a Christian church was Gothic, because it was the only style that emerged in the Christian era. And so it was perfectly fine for a Bible-believing church to decide that their church could only speak well of Christ if it had spoke with a Gothic language. And that speaks to that history. And so very often, a lot of that was being fleshed out on into about 1875 to early 1920s or so. Very often, if you see a little country church that has Gothic ornament on it, you can guess that it was built right around 1900s in there. That's where it came to common architecture in the U.S. So the crenellated parapets finally made it a Christian church. The entrances were modified aesthetically. The vestibules are the only piece of the sanctuary that is original. Everything else has been heavily modified. Structure is still intact, but you can't see that. The organs, I was talking with somebody, the organ was moved from the balcony forward. The chancel was enlarged at least once. The organ was replaced at least once due to flooding. As the river flooded before there were levees, it would flood all the way over to here. And so the organ was lost once in a flood. And stained glass was added last time. It's renovated heavily was in 1988. Some additional changes to the chancel and the balcony was enlarged. Technological breakthroughs. From this place, services were broadcast by telephone to a hospital. To the hospital is the corner of, where was it sent? I had it written down. But there was a hospital a few blocks over, at 6th and a couple of blocks that way, I believe. And the services were broadcast by telephone wire to the patients in the hospital. And then in 1922, the first radio broadcast of a Christian worship service was from this room. So great and thoughtful and innovative technological things were happening in this space and up through its history. And then for some of you here, particularly through AGO, the history that was published at the Bicentennial shows there were the hiring and firing of 2 or 3 organists, most of them for drunkenness. So, and we were talking about, and there was one in particular that was interesting who would apparently play the prelude and the early music, would go out drinking and then return unfit for duty, and he was confronted by the deacons and relieved of duty. So, all right. So into this setting we came, and I'll hit a handful of things that we do. Every critique, every renovation begins with a critique of the room that we find on the physical side, and then the way that I recommend and prefer that churches do it. It also begins with an honest understanding of what the ambitions of the church are for its ministry. And that may sound like I'm stating the obvious, but you would be amazed at how few churches simply seem to understand their purposes and leave them unspoken, or simply are unaffirmed, and don't take the time to say, this is why we're here, this is the vision that we have for ministry, here's the strategy that we have for ministry, and then they're prepared to answer the question, and these then are the tools that we require to carry that ministry out. And that you may think that applies to more pedestrian things like education and outreach and that sort of thing, but I believe it's an appropriate question to ask of worship as well, is to whom is worship directed, from whom is worship required, what is the experience to be like? For instance, is worship an act of evangelism, or is worship an act of encouragement, and those sorts of things that the church had thought through and so on. And that informs decisions like how important is congregational singing, and how important is what happens on that platform. And while many people enter the conversation with very strong points of view, it is too rare that they articulate them in the presence of other people. Sometimes they articulate them as they stomp out of the room, but so we need to do that. So this church, we began with an understanding that they had some clear priorities. One, and part of that, the reason it's important is architecture, because it's concrete, necessarily is a statement of priorities. When I place when we draw the line where the carpet is, it is here. And it's not here, and it's not there. When I use the word outreach, that may mean to you evangelism, or that may mean to you engaging the community, or that may mean to you strengthening the fellowship, and I can get away with that. But when when I choose geometry, it is concrete and discrete and finite, and it does not move, and so I have to make decisions about leadership and followership and priorities. So that's why it's important to do that. So some of those things we do. So what this church says is they value the work of the choir, and they value the participation of congregants. And one of the critical things in this particular church, and it's not true in every church, and I'm not offering this as a criticism or a validation, is that the priority, and we ask this question, if you are forced to choose between reinforcement of music and clarity of the spoken word, which would you choose? Now, we're in the business of both and we hope that we can have both with clarity, but the reality is it's very difficult to do without expensive adjustments, and that's what concert halls do, is they have adjustable acoustics, and they can, if they need to give clear voice to a clarinet concert, then they'll reduce the reverberation so you can hear those notes played, or if they need to blend something, that they can do that. And so this church made it very clear to us is the priority is to the spoken word. And the fact that Paul is slightly unsatisfied with the reverberation time means we nailed it. So we have done Catholic churches where the reverberation, average reverberation time in here was about 1.8 seconds. In removing the carpet, there were multiple layers, but in removing the carpet under the pews, we tweaked the high frequencies up a little bit. They're a little bit brighter, but the overall reverberation didn't change much. And it's slightly dry because I can fix that electronically, but I can't make it less live electronically. So that's what happens in a church that values the spoken word as much as it does the music. But I think we hit a good medium. You'll be the judge as you go. So let me roll on here. So some of the responses talked about the acoustics. The configuration always features pulpit font and table. Those are non-negotiables. Lighting is, we made improvements. We featured the architecture, changed paint colors, but didn't change anything about the geometry. And there were a lot of things competing for visual attention in this room, and we added a lot of wood in this area to give the weight, the visual weight to the platform. So that is the center of attention. And less things are, I've worked in a church that I had to say, and you don't know me very well, but I'm pretty direct. And I said, look, folks, it looks like the band's having a yard sale up there. And they had so much stuff going up on the platform. And they never did fix that, but anyway. We reinforced projection from the platform. There's some subtle things. I don't know if you'll get a chance to look at them, but we changed the geometry to do some early reflections and boost the sound out of the platform. And I've talked to you about the finishes. Okay. This a subtle thing, not so much to do with music, is there are no transitions into this space. And as part of the work of worship leaders is to prepare people for worship. Not only to participate in worship, but to prepare people for worship. Architecture can help by creating transitional spaces so that I know that when I've stepped out of the street and into the building, that something has changed. And when I move from the first space into the second space, something has changed. And then when I move into this space, I've been transported in a way from where I was, from the sort of consumed with every day, into something hopefully magnificent. And this building has no transitional space in it. So we did a little bit of tricks, and there's The vestibules are slightly different acoustically than this room to signal a transition, and there's some things envisioned in the master plan that'll help with that. So there's that. There wasn't a lot of opportunity to fix that. Paul mentioned that this was the neighborhood church, which means the entrance is over there, because if you didn't walk to church, you drove your carriage to church. In a generation later, 4 of you came in a car together with your white gloves and walked in the front door. And church now proceeds from this side in, which half the churches in America, I want to drive by and just flip them. Because they were designed for a generation that and a habit that no longer exists. We proceed in a different way. Symbolically, they can still be valid, but that's built into it. That's largely intractable problem, but we did open up both sides to make the approach a little less accidental. It used to sort of sneak in this corner, and so we've got sort of grand entrances on both sides as much as space would permit. Now, Paul wanted us to move a wall over, and I told him he'd have to take that up with Mr. Mills, because that had been that way for 200 years, and I wasn't going to touch it. But we pretty well left it. And one other set is the notion, and this is probably the biggest sort of cultural shift, is the concept of tight fit. This building, as designed and as it's been tweaked over the years, was to fit the current vision for ministry. And it fit that beautifully every time it was done. And when we got here, there were a lot of things that you could tell were envisioned when the last renovation was done. And we live in a culture where there's a little more experimentation, even within the confines of a powerful tradition. And tight fit is the concept. The alternative concept is loose fit, obviously. But loose fit isn't just more space, it's space that can be transformed more easily. And so that it isn't simply wrapped around our current vision of ministry. I would argue that if I simply build a church to fit my image of God today, and God reveals himself differently or calls me to respond to him differently, then I have built an idol. In other words, I have built my picture of God out of wood and stone. And so the notion is that this platform is able to respond as worship changes, as ideas are tried out. It doesn't change God, it just changes the approach to him. In this church of 200 years, you'll have a service in the morning that uses the organ beautifully, and at night brings on more contemporary instruments. And that's not wading into worship wars, just saying there are cultural things that require different things physically. So one of the ways primarily that we accomplish that is wing space, which is where our theater experience finally paid off, is that we have an organ garage. And I don't know if the folks will get a chance to look at it, but basically this whole console, everything up here can be rolled off stage. It can be turned into another kind of space. And so that they can try different things on. The history of the church in architecture for liturgy is that the needs have been met first with an engineering change. Round arches were the best engineering solution to creating large spaces to gather. And so people attached theological meaning to that and made their arguments. And then as engineering changed and offered a Gothic arch, the engineering solution presented itself. It was incorporated by liberal thinkers in that time, and then theological weight was attached to it, and it became sacred. The geometry became sacred. And we do that over and over again as we collect artifacts, or we collect geometry, or we collect music. And as it pleases us, for whatever reason, our motives, even if our motives are proper, we attach theological weight for it and wield it as a weapon. And so the purpose, our hope in this is that we would create a space that fit loosely enough that the essentials, to quote someone badly, that we can agree on the essentials and grant liberty on the non-essentials, and make a little room for this. So this platform, the risers are portable, the organ is portable, but the noblest materials in the room, that didn't make it cheap, the noblest materials in the room are permanent and placed where they belong. And the good news is that this church has, while it has worshiped in this building for 200 years, it has never worshiped this building. One of the questions I asked is, what may we not touch? And the leadership of the church says, everything is fair game, because we're not here about the building. And that was a blessing to hear from me. So we're free to use the building for its intended purpose, which is worship of the Most High God, and turn it loose to that purpose. And I think, if I may be so bold, as through the application of water and oil, we've restored it for future use. So that is all I wish to offer. So thank you.